My friends, today we are going to be diving into an episode that is going to elevate your drums altogether. And what this video is specifically going to be on is why your snare sounds like Can I not swear on the JST channel? Shoot. All right, well, I guess that's not a thing. I don't know what monetization is doing with that. Anyways, we want to make sure that your snare does not sound like poop, so stay tuned, my friends, because by the end of this episode, your snare is going to be sounding perfect. There are a lot of reasons why you could be having a bad sounding snare. We're going to be going over the top 10 reasons why, but we're going to do this in a really cool fashion because 5 of those reasons are going to be aimed towards using snare samples, and the other 5 are going to be aimed towards when you're tracking a live snare. And what this does is kind of make this video applicable for anybody that's dealing in music production. So if you guys are only here for real drums, feel free to go ahead in the video to the part that's timestamped so you can do that. And if not, you can stay and pay attention to the part about sample drums right now. So let's kick this off by starting with samples because I know that's what a lot of you guys are going to be using anyways. Sound selection. Sound selection is the most important aspect of mixing, period. Getting proper source material or choosing proper source material. When you dive into that chest of drum samples and start picking through, trying to find the perfect thing, you want to make sure that you're treating your sample library like the chest of gold that it is. Not just grabbing the first shiny thing that you see on top, but digging in there and picking between different samples until something actually accompanies the rest of the drum mix that you have and that you're working on. Basically, you want something that has the right character, punch, and matches the rest of the drums that you're choosing, because nothing sounds weirder than when you have a snare sample that doesn't even sound like it belongs with the kit that you're dealing with. An example of this would be when you have like a very large kick drum that's extremely roomy, and then you have something like, let's say, a piccolo snare. No matter what combination you're trying to do with those two things, it's not going to sound right. With this in mind, you're going to want to dive into different sound libraries until you find something you like. We're going to show the example right now of choosing the right snare for a mix. Once again, we've done this in previous videos, but this is just one step of the many, so wanted to revisit this really quickly. Do you see how the other options that were being chose for the snare in that particular drum mix just did not work? Trying to use a really high-pitched snare is not going to work there, one that's really low-tuned and thuddy. But yes, when it comes to samples, the next thing that we want to do is think of step 2, which is layering. This is where the magic really happens when you're dealing with snare samples, because if you have access to a snare sample, unless you tracked it yourself, so does everyone else. And this is the area where you can add depth and uniqueness to your snare sound, because you didn't track it, you didn't do that, but by taking an amalgamation of other snares and putting them together, you can now create your own sound. And I think that that's really important when you know, and I both know, that there are snares we hear all the time on albums and we're like, oh, that's the fob snare, oh, that's snare 12A, that's the GGD snare, that's the snare from the drum shot, like, you know what I mean? We're going to start recognizing these things all the time, and that happens a lot in metal music and rock music. I think I actually want to do a video on the top 10 most used drum samples. I think that would be a lot of fun, so I'm probably gonna do that later. But back on topic. Imagine that you have a really fat and punchy snare that, you know, kind of almost hits you in the chest when you're listening to it, but it doesn't really cut through the mix. So you're gonna grab a really bright snare that's really snappy, layer them together, and now you're going to have the best of both worlds. And the next thing you want to do, of course, is you want to adjust the volume of them. You want to then also make sure that they're in phase with each other, because everyone's making different sample libraries. Most of the time when somebody makes a sample library, they go through and make sure that everything is phase coherent with each other, but there's some libraries that don't do that, but most of them do. When you're grabbing stuff from different ones, that's not the case. So make sure to pay a lot of attention to that stuff. Eventually, you're going to happen upon something that is a sweet spot that is unique and nobody has ever heard before. What did you think of our latest secret weapon? I think that would actually kill in a ton of mixes. But on to our next step, velocity layers. This is huge when you're dealing with mixing because people that don't pay attention to velocity layers have things that sound very static, like a drum that just doesn't change at all. And that's not the way that drummers play. You have to remember in real life, like drummers get tired, or there's times when a song starts getting really exciting and in that moment they start hitting harder. That's a reality. That's something that happens in real life. When you have everything at 127 in a song, you're not going to portray that the right way. So that's the next thing you want to do, especially when you're doing snare rolls, or you're doing anything where there is a lot of snares happening. Even if it's something like blast beats, you don't want to just have it on 127 because it's going to sound terrible. Another thing you have to remember though is you now have the option of controlling every aspect of that drum performance. Take advantage of that. Not everyone has that luxury. And if you're dealing with a drummer that's not good, I would always rather use a MIDI drum kit than deal with somebody that does not know how to play drums well. I will take fake drums over a mid drummer any day. A great drummer, not the same scenario. I'll still layer with one shots and stuff like that, but I'd rather have a performance from a great drummer. If not, then, just go straight to that MIDI library. Doesn't make any sense to waste your time or their time. You're losing money, they're losing money. Well, you might actually be making money, but still, you should let them know, hey, by doing it this way, you're actually going to lose more money. We can get a better result and a faster outcome this way. As I said before, you're blending your snares, so you want to make sure you're doing that same thing for both of them, and their velocity layers might not match up properly. So they might have, let's see, 1 to 40 might be one velocity and 40 to 80 might be the next. They might not be the same on the other one. The other might be 1 to 60 and then 60 to 75 or something like that. So always try to find something that makes sense. On to our next step, sample blending. When we're thinking about blending samples, I'm not talking about just like layering samples, but truly blending them. We then want to start EQing these samples to make room for each other when they're hitting at the same time so that they kind of gel a little bit more and they feel like they're one instrument. Because a lot of times you'll have snares that will lay on top of each other and you can tell, you're like, oh, that's like, how many snares is that happening at the same time? Like, no, we want this to sound like one really solid snare hit. So as I was saying before, you might have that punchy snare and you might want to roll off a little bit of the top because you're not even loving the top of that anyways, and let it really shine on the snare that does that the best. And the same thing with that other snare, you might want to roll off some of the low end there because you love how fat and punchy the low end is on the other one. Let them work together to create a better instrument. And if you're wondering what snare you heard in that blend, that was Snare Smash from Joey's Drum Shots pack, and you can grab a copy of that in the description below. But like I was saying, doing this the right way is the key to getting a larger than life snare. And on to step number 5, processing the snare. Now that we basically have the structure of what our snare sound is going to be, we need to process it the right way and process them together. So we're going to send those snares to the same bus of compression, right? We want to make sure they're compressing together and clamping together. It's going to make them sound more cohesive, but not just compression. Now, if there's a type of EQ we want to do, we're going to treat this like it's one snare and we're going to EQ the whole thing to gel it together even more. And then if you want to start adding a little bit of saturation, maybe a little bit decapitator, something like that, you're going to bring out some excitement in that snare when it hits. And then of course, a clipper or transient designer to really make it snap. JST Clip is excellent for this. Transify is also excellent for this, but let's take a listen to processing a snare to get it to sound right. We're going to do this really quickly. now we're going to shift into real live drums. One thing I want to talk about first with that is drum heads. The voice of the snare starts with the drum head, and it's going to really bring out the character of what you have going on. I have a remote control sound on this guy right now. Absolutely love the Black Beauty. One of the best snares ever made. It's like if you have this and a Tama Bell Brass, those things go for like $5,000 now or whatever. Between those two, I think you have every snare sound that you would ever really need, unless you want a piccolo or something. Get a Black Beauty. If you're questioning and you have the funds to do something, get a Black Beauty. This is the one with 10 lugs instead of 8, but I actually prefer this one because it sustains a little bit longer, just my own personal preference. But the drum heads on here will change the way that this sounds drastically. A single ply head offers warmth and sensitivity, while a double ply head is more about durability and focus. You're going to want to experiment with different heads on your snare to see what you like best and which one is going to work in certain applications. Now on to reason number 7, drum tuning. Nobody likes anything that's out of tune, right? We don't like having vocals these days that are out of tune. We don't like our guitars out of tune. Why would that be any different when you're dealing with a drum? And there are tools to help you tune a drum. You know, there's drum dial, drum tuner, there's a bunch of different products out there. And what their main goal is to find a note to tune the drum to. There's a lot of arguments about whether you can actually tune a drum, but you can make it so that the drum is in tune with itself, and that's all that you need. It's not necessarily always about finding a specific note of the song. Some engineers and producers like it to sound that way, but to me it's more about just making sure the drum is in tune with itself. But this is really what makes your snare sing, and that deals with getting your lug tension to be proper and to be even as you're going around. You know, most people like to do a nice little quarter turn around from the beginning so that it's nice and even, and you can test it as you go. As you get towards the end, you can do a little bit of tapping around where the lugs are with the tuner and see where it hits, and if it's a little bit off, you give it another quarter of a turn. But that's one thing to always look out for when you're tuning drums. And this is definitely a way to make sure you get a good crack out of your drum too, by having it tuned properly. But let's get into the next topic of what makes a drum sound the way that it does, snare drum specifically, the snare wire. These little tiny strips of metal will drastically change the way that your snare drum sounds. Adjusting the tension and the number of wires is going to change in a large amount how that snare reacts. If you have the wires tighter, you're gonna have a crisper snare. If you loosen them up, just know that it's gonna be a bit fatter. That's just the nature of how snare wires work. At the end of the day, it's all about finding a balance that works for your style and whatever you're playing with. And now we wanna go into a pretty obvious one, microphones and placements. I could talk your ears off about this, but I have done this with some people that are much better than me. Mike Plotnikov, who you might know for have recording issues, or My Chemical Romance, and doing stuff with All American Rejects and some of the biggest bands in the world ever. That video specifically was about snare drums. I also did a miking episode on drums and kick drums, specifically with Josh Newell, who has done most infamously Linkin Park. So I think that we could just link to those videos, because those people are going to give you the real rundown on how to do that. I might do a little episode on that myself, kind of showing the techniques that they taught me and how I can transfer that information to you and what I learned in that process. But that'll be for another video. A very common snare mic for this is the SM57. Other people like to use i5s, and the way that you position your snare mic is going to affect the way that it responds, obviously, with how it's hit. You want to make sure that it's directioned and pointed directly at the center of the snare where it's being hit at. Like I said, we could go over this and talk about this, but just watch the video with Mike. It'll make it a lot simpler for you. And don't be afraid to experiment, but you know, most of the tried and true people that I know just say 57 on it, on top and bottom, and that's all that they need. So there you guys have it as far as dealing with microphone placements. And now I want to get onto the last step of this, room acoustics. The environment you record in can make or break your snare sound. I'm going to share some tips on optimizing your recording space. You know, one thing I like to do is adding diffusers in the room that you're going to be recording snare in, absorbers as well, because you don't want any of the first and second reflection points going and bouncing all around the room to the third and the fourth and the fifth. It starts becoming annoying. Once you kind of deaden that a little bit, you're going to really hear that snare shine in the room. Another thing that Mike mentioned in that video for controlling like hi-hat bleed and stuff like that is he would even put a piece of like acoustic foam between where the hi-hat is and where the snare is. And even that, by doing that, you're gonna affect how that snare sounds. Just make sure that you're tracking drums in a treated room. It's pretty obvious, and that's going to be really noticeable when you're dealing with overheads and your rooms. The direct mic, not so much, but once you start dealing with the other stuff that actually brings the kit to life, that's where you're going to notice that the room acoustics make the biggest change, or at least one of the biggest changes in how your drums sound. So my friends, those are the 10 reasons your snare actually sounds like shit. It actually let me say it that time. I think it has something to do with, now that we've broken down how to not do it, it has granted me the power of saying it for what it truly is. We all know that if the snare's not hitting right, the mix is not hitting right. So I want to thank you guys for watching this episode, and hopefully all of these tips will help you with your drum mixes in the future, especially getting a very unique snare tone to yourself. Are there any things that you feel like I missed? Do you want to get more in depth in this and talk about the type of hoops that you choose and stuff like that? If so, leave it in the comments below. We'll make a video about it and I'll chat with you fine people like I always do. Shit.